Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation.
Today we are at the Smithsonian Institution, and we are talking with Dr. Frank Blazich. And Frank, you are one of the curators here at the museum, but can you tell us exactly what your title is and what you do here?
So my full name is I'm Frank Blazich. I am a curator of modern military history here in the National Museum of American History, and I pretty much do everything 20th century military. I do Army, Navy, some Air Force. I do Marine Corps, Merchant Marine, Civil Defense, Civil Air Patrol, Coast Guard Auxiliary, and a bit of everything, really, about America's military experience in the 20th century. And thankfully for me, there's a lot to cover, so I'm never bored, and I'm always busy.
And you, not only do you work with a great many artifacts, but you write and research all these materials that you come across.
Absolutely. I certainly try to, as much as possible, to tie into the original mission of the Smithsonian, to increase and diffuse knowledge. So it's fun to have the physical objects, but the real joy comes out of telling the story behind the object, either how it came to be, or who owned the object, or how they came to acquire it. And there's a lot of mystery and a lot of myth there, too, sometimes. So you get to play Mythbuster and kind of dig into an object and really find out what the truth was, or at least an approximation of the truth. You can't always get exactly down to the foundation, but you can get close. And that keeps me busy and gives me something to do, in a crude way to put it.
Now, as this is our World War I podcast, what type of World War I materials do you have on display in the museum right now?
So right now, in our main military exhibition, which is called The Price of Freedom, Americans at War, we have one large case in that display focused on the First World War. There's two objects in particular for the animal lovers out there. We have Stubby, who was the mascot of the 26th Infantry Division. There was a movie that came out, I think, last year called Sergeant Stubby, animated film. Subject of many books, much loved. To some extent, he was the mascot of Georgetown. In terms of the Bulldogs, Stubby is believed to be kind of the origin of their mascot. We also have the famed World War I hero pigeon Cherami. Cherami is also on display there in the case. Another fun item, which is kind of just outside the case on what we call the reader rail, is the Distinguished Service Cross of General of the Army's John J. Pershing. Although I will give a disclaimer, General Pershing did not receive that medal for actions in World War I, but actually actions in the Philippines prior to World War I. But his actual medal is there on display, and I believe he received it on his 80th birthday. So there's just three items. We also have a Liberty engine, aircraft engine. There's Vickers machine gun. I believe we have a Lewis gun on display. German hand grenades, trench periscope, doughboy uniform.
Wow.
Kind of a whole bunch of objects just to give our visitors an overview, a taste, if you will, of basically what World War I had to entail. Doing a military exhibit that covers all the major conflicts, space can be a bit of a challenge. So a lot of our World War I items are not on display, and hopefully I can share a bit of them here with you today.
Well, of those items that are here in the Smithsonian, how do they come here? Like with Stubby or Cherami, both of which were live animals,
yes,
now are stuffed and are at the Smithsonian. Did they come from the Army or?
Well, in the case of Cherami, was a donation from the Army after Cherami's passing in, get my brain work here, in June of 1919. Cherami's remains were then transferred to essentially what was the National Museum of Natural History, where the taxidermist Nelson Wood mounted Cherami and prepared Cherami for display. And from that point, Cherami was then transferred over to what is now, we know today, the National Museum of American History. So that's how Cherami came in. Stubby remained with Stubby's owner, because Stubby was a private pet. And when Stubby passed away, Stubby's was essentially skinned. And so what you see there is the skin that was mounted, but Stubby's remains are cremated, and Stubby's ashes are inside the mount, are actually inside the mount. So a fun detail a lot of people don't know about Stubby.
Well, now, in working with all these things, and you have a vast amount of materials here, you run across things where you have no idea what it is at first, and then you have to go into it. And we're we're going to talk about a few of these things, your favorite pieces today.
Correct.
The first is the Medal of Honor of George McMurtry, who was with the Lost Battalion in World War I. Can you tell us a little bit about McMurtry and the Medal of Honor and how it got here?
Absolutely. So George McMurtry, George G. McMurtry, he's born in Pittsburgh in 1876. Really grew up in privilege. So he had a stable upbringing. He had a good education. He was actually a star athlete as well as scholar, and he was at Harvard University studying when the Spanish-American War broke out. Apparently the war was a lot more exciting than his studies, so he decided to leave Harvard and join Troop D of something known as the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. But nobody knows of it as that. They call them the Rough Riders. So he decides to go with former Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt down to Cuba, and he will fight as a Rough Rider for the war. After getting out of the service, he then goes to New York. I believe he finishes his studies at Harvard and becomes a stockbroker.
And becomes a millionaire, doesn't he?
Millionaire at the age of 30. So now World War I comes along, and I think he's 42. He has no obligation to serve, but he decides to attend the Plattsburgh training camp, and he's commissioned a first lieutenant in the 308th Infantry Regiment. He commands the E Company, and the 308th is in something known as the 77th Division, or the Metropolitan Division. It's made up of tons of young men from New York. So you have these officers who are these kind of privileged, educated, white-collar individuals really commanding a bunch of immigrants, first-generation Americans in many cases, and Americanizing them, so to speak. And here's a guy who's a millionaire on top of it, but also a combat vet in his defense. He goes overseas with the 77th. He'll rise to the rank of captain, and he's actually going to be commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 308. So that's going to be brain freeze up here again, E Company, F Company, G Company. So you mentioned this Lost Battalion action. So on October 2nd, 1918, the 1st and 2nd Battalion of the 308th Infantry Regiment. The 1st Battalion is commanded by a guy named Major Charles W. Whittlesey, also a lawyer by training, very quiet man in some respects. Whittlesey is going to take his 1st Battalion, so A, B, and C companies. McMurtry is going to support him with E, F, and G companies. They're also going to have the K Company of the 307th Infantry Regiment and C and D companies of the 306th Machine Gun Battalion. They're going to fight in the Argonne Forest. On October 2nd, they're very successful in their advance. In fact, they achieve their objective. But the problem is the units on their flanks do not. So they find themselves then cut off and surrounded by the Germans. They're called the Lost Battalion. They're not technically lost. We know they're there. We just can't get to them. So they're trapped. It's about 554 of these men. McMurtry, on October 4th, as they're fighting off the Germans, trying to capture or destroy them, he gets wounded in the knee by shrapnel. On October 6th, he gets wounded again, this time in the shoulder, from a big splinter of a German hand grenade, which we call potato mashers, because it's basically a little metal explosive on one end and a big wooden handle. And yet he still continues to serve Whittlesey, as Whittlesey is essentially executive officer, number 2. On the night of October 7th, American forces finally relieved the Lost Battalion and reached them. The next day, only 194 men of that original 554 walk out. For Whittlesey, McMurtry, and also Captain Nelson Holderman, these are the 3 main officers of that effort, will all receive the Medal of Honor for their bravery. McMurtry actually receives his on February 9th, 1919. At that point, he's going to rise to major in the Army, and he's going to separate. And he'll, in addition to his Medal of Honor, he also has a campaign medal from being with the Rough Riders. I believe the French give him the Legion d'Honneur, and he receives other decorations from Montenegro and I believe Italy as well, as does Whittlesey. McMurtry will pass away, dies, I want to say, in the early 1960s. And in 1964, it's his widow, Teresa, will actually donate all of McMurtry's military medals here to the Smithsonian. And that is actually how we came to acquire his Medal of Honor. It was on display many, many decades ago when we first had it, but since then it's largely remained in storage. And I like to highlight McMurtry's medal because it's a tie-in to Cherami. So we have Cherami on display as a participant, as the story is told in the Lost Battalion action, but McMurtry is the human component of that story. And that's why I like to tell it.
Amazing. Now, the next one is the Sperry depth charge. Now, this is a very important piece.
This is a cool one. So, for the listeners, if you're familiar with what a beer keg looks like, or perhaps we'll say small smoker grill, okay, or like oil drum. World War I, there's all these new technological marvels in warfare, and one of the most sinister is the submarine, particularly the German Untersee boat or U-boat. There's really no defenses against submarines early in the war, and I know that sounds crazy, but if the sub goes underwater, there's no means to find it. This is pre-sonar. So how do you destroy it? Well, there's sea mines. These have existed for decades prior. I mean, you can go back centuries. So the Royal Navy is going to begin chewing over, okay, well, we have these mines. Well, is there a way that we could make the mine a little more mobile? And from this, they're going to develop a mine that has a hydrostatic, what they call pistol, or it's basically a trigger that's actuated by water pressure. So you take this container, you fill it full of explosives, you throw it off a ship, it sinks to a certain depth and goes bang. The U.S. Navy in 1915, so before we enter the war, creates something called the Naval Consulting Board. And Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels creates it. It's run by a guy named Thomas Edison, probably familiar to a lot of people. One of the guys on this board is called Elmer Sperry. Sperry is the co-inventor of the gyroscope, a device that has really transformed the 20th century.
And Sperry Rand is...
Of Sperry Rand. So Elmer Sperry is going to chair this Naval Consulting Board's Committee on Mines and Torpedoes. Again, what do we do about the sub-threat? And on April 16th, 1917, so mind you, this is only 10 days after we've entered World War I, he files a patent application for something called a depth-controlled mine. We have one of these in the collection. It came here from Sperry Gyroscope in 1964, and when I got here, we weren't really sure what it was. And I managed to track down the original patent, and it's a really interesting device.
So it was just sitting on a shelf?
Sitting on a shelf, I profess rather dusty, kind of in the dark, right? What is this strange thing? But it looks like a small barrel or beer keg. A section of it's been cut out like a big pie wedge, so you can see the internal design of it. So what Sperry designed was, this thing weighed about 100 pounds, roughly. A sailor could actually manhandle it, toss it over the side. When it fell off the ship, the top part would break off and act as a buoy and a float. And there'd be a cable connected to the lower half that had about 50 pounds of gun cotton. And that would sink to a predetermined depth and then detonate. And what this is the U.S. Navy Mark I depth charge. This is the first ever attempt by the U.S. Navy to develop this anti-submarine weapon. Honestly, though, 50 pounds of explosive is just not enough. It's not going to work. We make 10,000 of these. As far as I'm aware, this is the only example left in existence in the United States.
Wow.
As soon as we enter the war and the first Navy destroyers make it overseas in May of 1917, they take one look at the British depth charge and they said, we want those. Because they're about 300 pounds. They look closer to like an 55-gallon oil drum. They are effective. They do manage to sink some submarines in World War I. And since then, the Navy has refined its depth charge technology. But what we have here is this granddaddy of them all. And interesting enough, developed by Elmer Sperry, as I said, co-inventor of the gyroscope.
Now, he wasn't working with any Brits. British at the time.
He wasn't. This was, as far as I know, an entirely American.
But did he know that they were working on it as well?
They were aware.
Okay. And
what eventually happened is we acquired patents or copies of the British plans. And one of the sources I found said we took the British design, tinkered with it, repatented it so we didn't have to pay patent royalties to the British, and then manufactured them. I think that becomes the Mark II depth charge. And those depth charges will largely be what we use in World War I, and we continue to refine the depth charge in World War II in particular.
And the Navy doesn't even have one of these Mark I's, do they?
As far as I know, the Navy doesn't. I checked with one of the Navy's museums. They said they don't have one in their collection. So I'm hoping to work with them in the future to potentially loan this object to them so that they can use it for display.
Now, our third piece is from one of the most famous men of World War I, General of the Armies, John J. Pershing. And this is his campaign medal that was created for him after the war. But it's a special one, isn't it?
Correct. So this is, we have General Pershing's World War I Victory Medal. Disclaimer, we actually have all of General Pershing's military decorations here at the museum. They were donated to the museum by his son after General Pershing's death. What makes General Pershing's World War I Victory Medal so unique is it has 14 battle clasps attached to it. He is the only member of the U.S. Army to receive all of the battle clasps, plus a clasp for what they call the defensive sector, so non-combat actions. The medal itself, it's the same medal that was issued to all the uniformed participants in the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps for the First World War. The medals are actually first struck in 1920. Pershing's is unique not just because of the battle clasp, but it's got a stamping, a very tiny stamping, at the base of the physical medal, or the planchette, from a technical term, and it's marked USM-5. We're not exactly sure what it means, but we believe it means United States Mint Medal 5. So this was the 5th medal ever struck from the dies, which begs the question, well, where are 1, 2, 3, and 4? There's a theory out there that number 1 went to President Wilson. Number 2 or 2 or 3 would go to the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, and the Secretary of War, Newton Baker. Possibly number 4 may have gone to Peyton March, who's Chief of Staff of the Army, and then that would give Pershing number 5. One of the interesting questions is, what about the Chief of Naval Operations, William S. Benson? Did he get number 6 or number 4? I don't know. So for those listening, there's a great research question. See if you can find another example of this medal, of any type of marking on the very, very base of the planchette.
Or any of those other guys.
Or the other guys. See if they have one.
Now, did any other items from General Pershing come here, or did the son only donate the medals?
So we have General Pershing's, most of his uniforms. Wow. We have his medals. We have presentation medals given by various communities, like Keys to the City, things like that. We actually have his office from his headquarters in France in World War I. So his desk, his chair, his file pads, ink blotter. They boxed up the whole office and donated it. So we have all of that.
Is it somewhere in a crate?
It's in a crate now. It was on display for the Centennial.
Next to the Ark of the Covenant.
Next to the Ark of the Covenant. We had General Pershing's desk and his chair out on display, as well as a reproduction of the battle map.
Wow.
That was literally the last week, basically the first week in November 1918, the last week of World War I, if you will. They had reproduced that map in his office, and we have that in the collection.
Has that ever been on display, though?
It was recently all on display.
Really? Wow.
We had it, as I said, for the Centennial. We took that exhibit down and rotated it with an exhibit commemorating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we currently have on display. But General Pershing's headquarters invariably will be on display in the future, perhaps for the 125th anniversary of World War I or another anniversary opportunity.
Yeah. Now, one of the weird ones
yes.
that you have, and this to us is just really amazing. You have the Valet kit for Kaiser Wilhelm II
yes.
of Germany.
Yes.
Now, this is just goofy. How does this get to the
This is one of these wild objects. The story is kind of too crazy to explain, but long story short, for the listeners, it is a black box. It's wood and leather and brass. It's just a big box, and the technical term is a field utility kit. But truth be told, the Kaiser wouldn't have been using this stuff in it. He'd have an aide or a valet doing it. It's got in there little tools. It's got a nail extractor, glass bottles, spurs, spare buttons. It actually has a dog collar for his dachshunds. And all of, how did we get this? And the crazy story is, it was acquired by a guy named Harry J. Anslinger. And Anslinger was the Commissioner of Narcotics under Presidents Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. And he managed to acquire it in November 1918 from Baron von Schroeder, who was one of the Kaiser's staff members. And the reason being is, and I'm going to bring up here a letter, actually, Mr. Anslinger, to explain to our listeners here. So he writes, it was several days before the armistice. Anslinger was attached to the American legation at The Hague in the Netherlands. And he was instructed by the United States government to make contact with Kaiser Wilhelm II's entourage. And at that point, he's abdicating. He's trying to cross the border into the Netherlands to get, I'm butchering pronunciation, to the castle of Count Bentinck of Amerongen. Listeners, look that up for me. And this castle actually had been used by Charles I of England as a refuge when he was trying to flee when he had been fleeing his country. So anyways, they do actually manage to meet up with the Kaiser's entourage. And it's this point that Anslinger meets Baron von Schroeder and obtains the Kaiser's field utility kit. And the Kaiser had carried this at his military headquarters on all the battlefronts. And it's got his seal on the cover, and it's, like I said, a couple items related to him. Turns out the dog collar in there not only has Kaiser Wilhelm's seal on it, it's got a Berlin dog license for his dachshund. And with this being said, Anslinger has this thing and brings it back. It's even got a stamp when it passed through customs in New Jersey. And after the war, he basically put it in the Treasury Department's vault. And it sat at the Treasury Department in its vault, I guess, with gold and bullion and all sorts of treasures from like the 1920s until the Smithsonian gets this thing in 1959. And it was on display, I want to say back in the 60s, maybe early 70s. And then since then, we've just kind of, like, it's already in its own box. We've just had it in storage. And I came across it one day, and I saw it, I'm like, what is that? They're like, oh, that was the Kaiser's. And so I started digging into it. And so you got an interesting story here because it's the Kaiser. It's World War I. For listeners, look up Anslinger. He's got an interesting story to him. As well as look up Baron von Schroeder, who also has an interesting story because he returns again in World War II. And he's actually going to be an officer in the SS. He's going to be tried and convicted of crimes against humanity. I mean, you got a lot of interesting, nefarious characters.
Sidelights, yeah.
Sidelights tied into one object. So it's a great example here of how you can have a single object that's tied into a lot of different stories. And that's the best part of my job is just finding out these stories and going, whoa, did you know about this?
And the final piece that we have, and this is a piece that you collected.
Yes.
And can you tell, this is the Artbook of Charles Mauro.
So this is a really cool piece that came here to the museum earlier this year. So Charles Caesar Mauro, Pennsylvania, son of Italian immigrants, and he had worked, after school, he had basically worked on the Great Lakes as a seaman aboard ships. And he survives a couple shipwrecks and then takes up sketching. He discovers he's got a talent for drawing. So he goes back to Paterson, New Jersey, where his family had moved, and he begins drawing cartoons. Some of these get published. He then goes to Chicago, and he'll take night classes at the Art Institute of Chicago. But when America enters World War I, he's a very patriotic man, and he enlists on July 13th, 1917, so very early on. He's first assigned artillery, but then finds himself reassigned to the 1st Division and in an engineer regiment. So he goes overseas in late 1917 to France. As soon as he gets over to France, in about January 1918, he asks a YMCA worker to get him a sketchbook, or just get him kind of a blank sketch pad. And he will proceed from January 1918 till he's wounded and gassed in October 1915. He draws. He draws the battlefront. He draws what no man's land looks like. He draws combat. He sketches all this out in pencil. And here's a combat engineer. He's a sapper. He's going to be in the tool sector. He'll be in Cantigny. He'll be at Soissons. He'll be at Salares. And then he'll be at Meuse-Argonne. He's actually gassed on October 5th, 1918, by mustard gas, the Meuse-Argonne. It's just an amazing amount of combat, and he's there for the first of it, really the tip of the spear for everything. Well, he comes home. He's honorably discharged. He leaves the Army in 1919, and he'll work for the Buffalo Courier, but he does a lot of his time for the New York Herald Tribune, and he'll be a cartoonist for the New York Herald Tribune for many decades, and retire from there, and retire to upstate New York, where he dies in 1980. But he keeps his sketch pad. He takes his original pencil drawings and he colorizes them, and he goes back and he kind of refines the artwork, if you will. His granddaughter reached out to me, and they said, we have this, it's a family treasure. He had kept this in his mess kit the whole time of the war, and they brought it here to the Smithsonian this year and added it to our collection. It's an amazing example of art, not as an official American Expeditionary Forces artist, but as the common man, and able to capture a window onto the war that is so unique unto itself, and by someone who's with the 1st Division. He's there at the very beginning of everything.
Now these, to me, they're some of the best drawings I've ever seen of World War I. I mean, just in a small glimpse. Were any of these ever published?
A handful that I know have shown up in newspapers, particularly in Syracuse. I think it's the Syracuse Post-Standard, way back in the day, printed like a few of them, just a handful of them.
Well, that's where he was from, wasn't it?
Correct. Yeah, and he was up in Pulaski, New York, and he had also written for some of the Syracuse papers or drawn cartoons. So they published some of his stuff in the 70s or maybe 80s by the family, but the vast majority of this have never been seen, never seen by scholars or researchers.
Is there any plans to put something out?
The hope is to do possibly a digital exhibition, and share some of these drawings with the public. And that's part of the goal of the family, too, is to be able to, something that they've treasured, they wanted to share with the nation and make this incredible window onto the war available for all visitors to see.
Well, we all look forward to that. And Frank, we want to thank you for sitting down with us.
It's my pleasure, and thank you all for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.